Learners, how are you doing? I hope the holiday is fine. Don't forget to wash your hands, endeavor to wear your mask, and stay home. It's the only way you can stay safe. We previously looked at the reasons why the long distance trade declined. Once again, this is Teacher Drusilla from Trinity College Navingo. Today we're going to focus on the effects of long distance trade. We're going to take back in time and wonder how did this trade affect the livelihoods of the East Africans, those that participated in the trade, how impactful was the trade? And whenever you're talking of effects as history students, we look at both positive and negative effects. So on a positive note, the African chiefs and kings that participated in the trade acquired a lot of wealth. By wealth, according to these African chiefs, they were able to acquire very many guns. They were able to get goods that they were not having initially. And these guns were used to expand their kingdoms. And they became well equipped with their societies. Then the trade routes that were used in the long distance trade. When I talk of trade routes, I mean the central route that was controlled by the Nyamwezi, the northern route controlled by the Akamba, and the southern route. These routes later developed into major highways. If you look at the trace of the railway line, let me look at the Kenya railway line. It ran from Mombasa through Taita Hills of Voi. Then it went as far as western Uganda. That is the same route that was used during the long distance trade. So the trade routes later were used as major highways. Another positive impact you can look at is that African kings and chiefs were able to expand their empires. The case in point in this case is Mirambo. Mirambo became a renowned prominent trader during that time. He was able to expand a small Ugowe kingdom into a very large Urambo empire by the 1870s. How did he do this? He was able to acquire guns through the trade from the Arabs, which guns he used to fight wars of expansion by attacking the small neighboring societies like the Vinza, the Sumba. So with this was able to put up a very strong empire that existed for so long. Then these trade centers like Ujiji, Tabora, Bagamoyo, Mombasa, Lamu, Kilwa later became very major towns. With any function of a town, they became commercial centers, they became administrative centers, and these were initially used as trading centers where the traders would rest. This is where the commodities would be picked from. So, on a positive note, these trading centers developed into very major towns. Still in this trade, Africans were able to acquire new crops in the interior of East Africa. We said in this trade, the foreigners would move from the coast to the interior, and as they would come to the interior, they are carrying their own goods. They are having goods they're bringing to the people in the interior to exchange. So, among the goods that were brought into the interior were the gunpowder, the firearms, the mirrors, the guns, the glassware, the beads. So Africans for the first time were able to enjoy foreign manufactured goods, and to them, to the Africans, they held so dearly onto these goods. They were able to put on clothes. Some African societies were able to wear clothes for the first time, and this boosted their standards of living. So Africans were able to enjoy foreign goods. Then in this trade, we see as Europeans kept entering into the interior of East Africa, the Arabs especially, they impacted on the people in the interior with their cultures. So we cannot rule out the fact that Swahili culture was introduced in the interior. If you remember the Swahili culture, it was based at the coast initially when the Arabs had not yet penetrated into the interior. But with their penetration into the interior, they spread the same cultures to the interior people. For example, the styles of dressing, where the women would wear the long silk dresses and veils, while the men would wear the kanzus, the turbans, Swahili culture involved, so we look at the dressing style, their eating styles, where they would eat pilau, chapati, the new foods. Then we shall look at the ways of dressing, sitting cross-legged. All that entails the Swahili culture. So these same cultures were em- embraced by the Africans. They adopted these Africans and they gave up their traditional cultures. Then, still in this trade, since it involved foreigners, where goods would reach at the coast and be transported to European countries like Malaysia, Brazil, um, to Europe, basically to Portugal. So East Africa was linked to the outside world. It removed the initial misconception of Africa as a dark continent to now a place where you would get gold and slaves after exchanging a few mirrors, a few clothes. So East Africa was exposed to the outside world. And I think exposure to the outside world became beneficial because these Europeans ended up coming, for example, the missionaries, the explorers, they kept coming in here and they developed us politically, socially, and economically. So perhaps they would never have known about East Africa had it not been the long distance trade. Still, it led to the coming of Europeans into the East African interior. Initially, when most of these Europeans would come, they would stop at the coast. But with the long distance trade, they started penetrating the interior. So it led to the coming of Europeans into East Africa, especially in the interior. They would no longer stop at the coast, but rather go ahead and penetrate the interior. Then, during this trade, as they exchanged guns, the interior tribes were able to acquire guns that were used to fight wars against their enemies, and that boosted the security in the interior. The weaker societies that could not fight for themselves or defend themselves from the attacks. For example, Kabadega was able to acquire guns that were used to fight the Baganda. The Nyamwezi kept attacking the small Uvinza tribes or societies. The Masai and the Yao, the Nandi, were able to fight each other because of the acquisition of guns, and this was only possible through the long distance trade. During this trade, as Arabs entered into the interior, they taught Africans how to build. This business of sleeping in grass thatched houses was no more. Arabs brought in a new mode of building, that is the Arabic architecture, that was characterized by building flat-topped houses to replace the grass thatched houses, and that boosted the standards of living of the Africans. So we must appreciate that during this trade, Africans benefited so much, but at the same time, it brought some negative implications. For example, the constant raids that were done by the Africans. We saw societies like the Nyamwezi, the Akamba, who are known for supplying slaves. It's not like the slaves would just come and register to go. These slaves had to be acquired through the constant raids. And those constant raids later on resulted into massive depopulation in the interior. And as slaves kept going to the coast and beyond to the European countries to go and work on the plantations, they depopulated the interior. So, on a negative note, we must talk about the heavy depopulation. Due to the trade that was going on as well, people shifted their attention from agriculture to trade. So, agriculture was neglected, and that later in the long run resulted into famine. And at the same time, during the raids, the farmlands, the gardens were all destroyed because the raids were massive. They would attack in the wee hours of the night when Africans were not armed, and this was done in a bid to acquire slaves. So it had a very negative impact on agriculture. Still, the same trade resulted into the emergence of social misfits. When I talk of social misfits, and I'll give an example of the Ruga fighters. Ruga were the bandits, military groups, for example. The Maviti, the Ruga. These came in and they were usually hired to fight African chiefs would use these Ruga fighters who would wear fierce faces to scare the traders, to ambush the smaller and weaker societies, to submit into slavery and slave trade. So these Ruga soldiers later on became full-time fighters that were hired in attacking the weaker society. So they caused a lot of tension and suspicion in East Africa, and that resulted into a lot of insecurity in the interior. The massive destruction of property because of the raids. These raids, we said, were done when Africans were unarmed in the wee hours of the night. So there was a lot of destruction of property, and the property was destroyed because they were trying to remove the hiding places for the people that would be hiding. So massive destruction of property resulted into insecurity, suspicion, tension, and fear. People are living in fear because anytime it would be under attack. Then the local industries declined because Africans now changed their demands from demanding for locally made products to demanding for the foreign manufactured goods. Initially, as Africans would do their papyrus harvesting, do their cottage industries, they were no longer on demand because African made goods were neglected as the foreign goods flooded the markets, and that was on a negative note. Due to the coming of the Arabs in the interior and spreading the Swahili culture that involved the speaking of Kiswahili language, there was a lot of massive deculturalization and detribalization. Africans boosted so much in their ability to practice the foreign man's cultures. So it's so African norms and customs being put on the side and foreign cultures being embraced as the new way of life. And to make matters worse, Africans lost trust in their leaders, especially the African chiefs and kings, who in most cases would pick them on and give them off as slaves in exchange for guns, in exchange for small mere property like clothes. So Africans lost a lot of trust in their leaders. So the long distance trade had quite a number of political, social, and economic effects. Since we have literally finished the topic of long distance trade, I would task you. I believe by now you can answer any question on long distance trade. And with long distance trade, we analyze basically 4 questions. You can talk about why the trade developed, how it was organized, what roles did the Africans play in this trade, what were the effects of this trade, and then the problems that were faced. When you look at the problems, most of these problems cut across because the problems that faced the traders are the same reasons why the trade ended up declining. So I am giving you those 4 questions as a food for thought. Find out how the trade was organized. You must be able to describe the organization of the trade, right from who participated, which items were extended or exchanged, which routes were followed, which language was used, which religion was practiced, and so on and so forth, to what factors led to the decline, the effects, and then eventually how Africans involved themselves in the trade. I have been Miss Nangoma Drusilla. Thank you very much for listening to me. For more resources, visit the link below. Keep safe, stay home, wash your hands, and keep that mask on. Thank you very much. Have a good day.